Hi everyone, Paul here from familywheels.ca with another car review for your growing family. And this week, we're in an SUV that I'm really surprised we haven't featured with you yet. And that's because the Ford Explorer molded this segment some 28 years ago. You see, back in 1990, way before SUVs were the family car to own, the first Explorers started rolling off the lot and they kind of changed the world. And while larger choices like the Expedition have since come on the market, if you look at the classic size of this SUV, it's obviously still resonating with people because year to date, Ford Canada has sold over 7 times as many Explorers over its supersized sibling. And that's despite the fact that the Explorer is kind of running on some older tech at this point. This 5th generation has been around since 2011. So all these years later, without a recent update, is the Explorer still making waves? Well, we're gonna hit the back roads of British Columbia, put all of our regular family gear into this thing, including car seats, and see if it's worth your consideration this week here on Family Wheels. So the Explorer is a carryover for 2018, which means there are no major changes. But the one big thing is that you can now get the suite of safety features that we're seeing on a lot of other cars these days. Things like adaptive cruise, forward collision mitigation braking, blind spot monitoring, and lane keep assist as a $1,200 option on this XLT trim we're driving. The Limited and the Sport also an option, and as standard on the Platinum trim. Now there are a lot more changes coming for 2019. The base version of this vehicle won't be available in Canada anymore, and it will start at the best-selling XLT instead. And the 2.3-liter EcoBoost engine will become the base engine. Four-wheel drive will also become standard for Canadian models of the Explorer in 2019. But as it stands right now, for 2018, you can get into a base version of this vehicle for $31,800 Canadian. You really don't see a lot of those bare bones versions out on the road though, because it has 2-wheel drive and is super slim on features. The good news is that all Explorers include 3 rows of seating, but you've got to go up a few notches for really simple things like 2 zones of climate control or heated front seats or Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, tech that we're seeing as pretty mainstream base offerings these days. Now, if you want this best-selling XLT like we have here with 4-wheel drive, you can get into one of those for 42 grand, but the options can get away from you. Here, as tested, we have $11,000 worth of extras. A $1,750 dual sunroof, $500 for a power lift tailgate, a $2,100 rear seat entertainment system, $1,200 for leather seats, a higher grade sound system. The list goes on here, and like we often see in Ford vehicles, it drives the price up pretty quickly and rounds up our as-tested price to nearly $53,000 Canadian. And we only have the base V6 on board here, which is kind of underwhelming to drive, but is also kind of thirsty, which is a bad combination. After all those extras, we're getting pretty close here to the top of the line Platinum trim though, which starts at $60,700 and automatically includes the more lively EcoBoost V6. But if fuel economy is your main concern, then there's the 2.3-liter EcoBoost, which puts out 280 horsepower, reportedly sees 10.8 liters per 100 kilometers as your all-around average. That makes it pretty good compared to much of the competition, but passing performance, towing capacity, those sorts of things are going to suffer. Meanwhile, the larger 3.5-liter EcoBoost has 85 more horsepower than we see in that 4-cylinder and can tow up to 5,000 pounds as long as you have the proper towing package on board. No matter which engine you pick though, it's all getting pumped through a pretty old-school 6-speed automatic transmission. A transmission that's not nearly as efficient as we're seeing in many of its competitors these days, or even if we stay in the Ford family here for a second, that 10-speed that we're seeing in the F-150 or the Expedition, far better for fuel economy. Just as a point of reference here, that Expedition that we were driving around through some pretty cold, pretty snowy weather last winter actually saw better results than we're seeing here this week. 12.5 liters per 100 kilometers in the Expedition versus a pretty thirsty 13.3 liters per 100 kilometers as our average here in the Explorer. That's 17.5 US miles per gallon, which falls way behind others in this class like the Toyota Highlander or the Honda Pilot or the Chevy Traverse. It is a confidence-inspiring, smooth rig to drive though, with a respectable 66 decibels of cabin noise at 100 kilometers an hour and a well-tuned, comfortable ride for just cruising along, if not a little bit spongy when you start to make any quick changes of direction in the corners. But that bit of body roll and extra ground clearance does mean that the Explorer holds its own on the back roads. It's certainly more capable than many other more sort of city-minded crossovers that are coming out these days, and there is the optional terrain management system like we have here for dialing in the traction and throttle response to exactly the sort of terrain that you're driving through. And I think despite the fact that the Explorer is getting on in age, it still looks pretty good from the outside, holding on to those more rugged truck routes that a lot of other SUVs and crossovers are kind of moving away from. Inside though, I don't think time has been quite so kind. While seats are very much a personal preference thing, here in the Explorer they are very soft and pretty unsupportive, even for short trips around town. My back is getting tired in these things, and this optional micro suede in our test are really tough to keep clean with a family. It's hard to wipe down after a spill. This twin panel moonroof here, also a bit of a blast from the past in a world where, you know, larger, more continuous single pane panorama sunroofs have become the norm, and many of the plastics here in the cabin feel really cheap and would scratch up very easily. And perhaps most concerning for families in a time when a top safety pick rating from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety has really become the expected norm, the 2018 Explorer received poor marks for passenger side small overlap front collisions and marginal marks here on the driver's side. Now, speaking of your kids jumping into the second row, it's a bit tighter in there than I had expected, which is fine for Roger in his front-facing car seat, but with a rear-facing car seat, we measured out 26.5 inches from the back of the front passenger seat up to the glove box, and that's going to be a surprising pinch for an SUV in this class. The payoff, though, is a third row that is more spacious than many of its competitors. Getting back there is a bit of a multi-step pain, not quite as convenient as we saw in the reimagined Expedition earlier on this year, but once I got there, it was surprisingly good, even for adults. Although I should say that while many in this class offer seating for 8, the Explorer maxes out at 7. But if it's stuff, gear that you have to haul around, this is one of the places where the Explorer really shines. Behind the third row, there's 595 liters of cargo space, which is bigger than a lot of sedan trunks that we test and more than capable of swallowing up our standardized trunk test: a stroller, diaper bag, camera bag, 2 bags of groceries, and a soccer ball. Then make the multi-step but still fairly easy conversion into a 2-row SUV, and that trunk balloons up to 1,243 liters. And when you flip that second row down, the load floor is flat and vacuous, tons of space. You're basically driving around a covered pickup truck at that point. Now, if manually flipping down these seats just seems like too much of a pain for you, there is the option of motorized second and third row seats, but you're not going to get that until you get into the higher level trims. Well, despite a slew of choices when it comes to crossovers and SUVs in the Ford family of vehicles, the Explorer continues to have a loyal following all these years later. It is, however, feeling a bit dated compared to the slightly smaller Ford Edge or the larger Expedition, which we were really impressed with last winter and saw surprisingly good fuel economy numbers out of. If, however, you really like the size and the history behind the Explorer, we are starting to see some early pictures and figures of a brand new Explorer that's reportedly coming out for 2020. And from what I can see, it looks really good. So it appears that this longtime workhorse from Ford isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Remember, you can always check out familywheels.ca for a bullet point report card of all the vehicles that we test. And of course, if you like what you're seeing, throw a subscription our way. We'd love to have you do that, and we'll see you next time right here on Family Wheels.